Um, so good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Newman. I'm the Chief Executive of the AJR, the Association of Jewish Refugees. And I guess I have the honor this evening, this afternoon, to welcome you all to this event. And we do so in conjunction, in partnership with Insiders, Outsiders, a program, a festival that we've been delighted to work with these past 18 months, 2 years or so. That doesn't need me to tell you, has delivered a fascinating series of events, rich cultural heritage of the refugees, brought back from 80 plus years ago, and that includes the event this afternoon. I am going to take this opportunity as a shameless plug for those of you who are less aware of the core role of the AJR, which is the provision of the social welfare services, assistance to Holocaust survivors and refugees, just in case you are aware of anybody that could benefit from those services. Obviously, with the continuation of lockdown, that becomes even more critical, and that's where our primary role is focused. Actually, the Zoom events have given us a new venture into using this technology to keep in touch with those of our members. But if you're aware of anybody that needs more specialist assistance, then please do contact us via our website or our phone number and email and so on. So I think at that point I'll say welcome to everybody and to hand over to Monica, who will then introduce our speakers, and to congratulate Monica again on a first-class series of events during the festival and our continuing partnership. Monica.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for partnering on this particular event as well. I think I should simply set the ball rolling by introducing our three participants. One of them some of you will already have encountered earlier this afternoon in conversation with Daniel Snowman, another fabulous event. So I'll start with him, with Norbert Meyn. Now, I don't know how many of you can actually see him, but you will shortly. Norbert was born in Weimar in the former East Germany and first came to Britain in 1990 after the fall of the Berlin Wall. He studied singing and music in Dresden, Riga, Latvia, Weimar and London, and in the 1990s was busy curating exhibitions in the visual arts in Germany. Since the late 1990s, 98 to be precise, he's worked as a freelance singer, language coach, vocal coach, and project curator here in London, and he teaches at the Royal College of Music and also at Guildhall School. Most relevantly for us today, he's been undertaking research about the legacy, the tremendous rich legacy of the immigrant musicians from Nazi-dominated Europe and Britain since 2012 at the Royal College of Music, which resulted in two-pronged achievements, really. One is the website entitled Singing a Song in a Foreign Land, and also the creation of the chamber music group, the Ensemble Émigré, which, as the name suggests, is dedicated to performing the work of those composers. And bringing us right up to the present, Norbert is the principal, indeed the initiator, and the principal investigator of the new Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project entitled, perhaps rather more prosaically, Norbert, Music, Migration and Mobility, very much now raring to go, but sadly sort of halted by COVID, but waiting, I think, to restart. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Alison Garnham, who's a music historian and the biographer of Hans Keller, of whom we will hear much, much more. She's currently a visiting research fellow at Cambridge University, where in 1996 she was the original archivist of the Hans Keller archive when it was first established at the University Library in Cambridge. Her many books on Keller include Hans Keller and Internment of 2011, which is most relevant to the present discussion, which examined Keller's wartime experiences and their effect on his intellectual maturation. And last but certainly not least, I have the pleasure of introducing Andrea Rauter, the daughter of Ferdinand Router, about whom you'll hear much more also. She's worked as a teacher in mainstream as well as in special needs education until 1996. And whilst teaching, she initiated a number of EU-wide education projects. From 1996 to 2011, she worked as music and special projects manager for the Austrian Cultural Forum here in London. Many of you will be familiar with that, very useful location and institution, where she project-led various festivals, including, perhaps most relevantly here, the Austrian Jewish Cultural Festival in collaboration with the Jewish Music Institute. Since then, Andrea has continued working as an independent project manager and is in the board of the Anglo-Austrian Music Society and also trustee of the Cosman Keller Art and Music Trust. Thank you very much, and over, I think, to Norbert.
The only thing I wanted to say, please, if you have any questions during the event, do put them in the chat and address them directly to me. We will try to make time for those at the end. And Alison Garnham is going to start with a more general historical introduction. And so over to Alison, please.
Thanks, Norbert. Well, we thought that before we get into the detail that you might like to have a little bit of context so that we can locate this period of life in Mooragh camp within the general history of Second World War internment in Britain. Because this period when Rauter, Gelhorn and Keller were together in Mooragh was rather more settled than their earliest experiences had been. For each of them, this was the last camp that they were in before their release, and conditions by then were considerably better. Speaking very broadly, this was the third phase of the government's internment policy in Britain. The initial policy that was announced in September 1939 changed radically in the spring of 1940, and then changed again, and this time more gradually, in the summer of that year. So originally, when war first broke out, it had not been the intention of the Home Office to resort to the mass internment of civilians. Britain had interned some 30,000 German nationals during the First World War, but had concluded afterwards that it hadn't done any good. So in 1939, the Home Office instead set up a nationwide network of tribunals. So every German and Austrian national was required to appear before their local tribunal and be categorized according to the degree of risk that they were thought to pose to national security. So they were categorized A, B or C, and only those put in category A were interned immediately, and that was just a few hundred people. Category B, was about 6,000 or so, were not interned but subject to certain restrictions, such as not being allowed to travel more than 5 miles from home. But the vast majority, and this is well over 60,000 people, were put in category C, designated friendly enemy aliens, which was the phrase, and allowed to get on with their lives without restriction. Now that initial policy was abandoned very suddenly in the spring of 1940. And the major drivers of the change were the shock of the Blitzkrieg and the anxiety after that about the potential invasion of Britain, together with a determined campaign against the refugees in the popular right-wing press, led by the Daily Mail, of course, portraying the refugees as potential German spies. Now, government policy changed immediately after Churchill became Prime Minister on the 10th of May. And the Home Office lost control over internment. And there followed a series of mass arrests during May and June, starting with those who were living near the south or east coasts, right up to Inverness. Then those in category B were arrested no matter where they lived. And then finally, then when Italy entered the war on the 10th of June, Italian men were interned. And then finally, with the fall of France, all category C men. The speed at which all this happened meant that that period of internment was chaotic and horrible. It was obviously very difficult suddenly having to find somewhere to imprison thousands of civilians. And the extreme haste meant that some of the most basic facilities were lacking, and there was considerable disorder and confusion. Ferdinand Router spent the early part of his internment in one of the worst of those initial makeshift camps, Worth Mills, a disused cotton mill near Bury, where conditions were particularly awful. And he wrote in his diary, "Worth Mills can only be described as purgatory or hell." Hans Keller spent several months in one of the biggest camps in Huyton on the edge of Liverpool. This was initially a bit better because it was a requisitioned housing estate. But the houses were new builds and there was no furniture in them. Everyone slept on sacks of straw, several to a room, and as the numbers increased, conditions quickly deteriorated. By the time Keller arrived there at the end of June, the houses were full to bursting and he was put in tent number 220. Huyton was a transit camp with a rapidly shifting population. And its proximity to the Liverpool docks meant that it was from there that many internees were sent overseas. When the decision was made to, and these are Churchill's words, remove all internees out of the United Kingdom. And they were sent not just to the Isle of Man, but thousands went to Canada and Australia. In many cases, the deported internees didn't know where they were going, and there was no chance to inform relatives. Throughout this phase of internment, there was very little communication at all with the outside world, which enormously increased the anxiety. Some internees even thought that the chaos in the camps must be a sign that the Germans had already landed, and there were several suicides in Huyton. Government policy began to change again from July. Change was slower this time, but it's significant that it started before there was any change in the military situation. The prospect of a German invasion was still very real. They were already occupying the Channel Islands, and the main Battle of Britain was still to come. So this change of policy was not driven by external events. And the spy fever whipped up by the Daily Mail had by no means abated. But now that the mass roundup was complete, it was clear that there was simply no evidence of a coordinated German spy network amongst the refugees. And considerable opposition was now mobilizing in Parliament, galvanized by reports of the awful conditions in the camp, and particularly by the torpedoing of the Arandora Star, which was one of the deportation ships carrying internees to Canada. 700 drowned in that disaster. So from that point onwards, the mass internment policy was in retreat. The deportations were halted, and the administration of the camps was transferred back to the Home Office on the 18th of July. The first white paper with limited release procedures was published on the 31st of July, and a small number of releases began in August. News trickled back to the camps, and Ferdinand Router wrote in his diary on the 24th of July, "We find out that we are now to be put under the jurisdiction of the Home Office, and that cheers us all because we believe that this will be the end of the worst of our miseries." And it was. Although they remained interned for many more months, Rauter until the 9th of December, Gelhorn until the 21st of January, and Keller until the 23rd of March, conditions did begin to improve substantially from this point, and internees now had the realistic hope that sooner or later release would come. Newspapers were now allowed in the camps, books and sheet music could be sent in, and communication with family and friends outside became a lot easier. On the 27th of July, Ferdinand Router was transferred to Prees Heath camp, which, although it consisted entirely of tents, was an improvement on the awful Wharf Mills. In his diary, he even rather gamely said that it feels a bit like a summer holiday camp. His confiscated music was returned to him, and a couple of days later, as we're about to hear from Andrea, he met Norbert Brennan, and Norbert had his violin with him, and this is when music came back into Router's life. On the 23rd of July, in Huyton camp, Hans Keller managed to get his violin sent into the camp by his mother, and a week later he was back to playing string quartets again, led by the great Oscar Adler. So it's at this point that the musical life of the camps began to flower, and nowhere more so than in the more settled environment of the Isle of Man, where Peter Gelhorn now was. Ferdinand Router was transferred there at the end of August, and Hans Keller arrived in October 1940. Now, there was a whole series of internment camps dotted all over the Isle of Man. Mooragh camp was in Ramsey on the northeast coast, and it was the first internment camp to be set up on the island at the end of May 1940. It consisted of a series of tall terraced boarding houses along Mooragh Promenade, requisitioned and cordoned off with barbed wire fences. The boarding house owners had been instructed to leave all the furniture in situ, so many internees now got the chance of sleeping in a bed, although they may have had to share it with a stranger. There were also reasonably equipped kitchens, and in several of the houses there were pianos. There's just one last thing to mention now, and that is the high degree of self-organisation by the internees in the camps on the Isle of Man. In fact, all the internment camps had relied from the beginning on a lot of work by the internees. For example, they generally did all the catering. Cooking was centralised in most camps, but on the Isle of Man it was done by each house, so things felt a lot more homely. On the other hand, the quality of the food varied considerably. As you can imagine, many of the middle class and male internees had never cooked before. The internees' desire to help each other also meant that they took their own initiative in lots of areas that were lacking in the camps, and throughout the camps, formal collaboration developed between the prisoners and their guards. For example, a severe shortage of medical personnel led to internment camps relying very heavily on the refugee doctors. In Mooragh, the official camp medical officer seems mostly to have dealt with outside matters like referrals to hospital or applications for medical release. The refugees had an elaborate system of elected representatives who dealt with the camp authorities. They ranged from the overall camp supervisor at the top to the house fathers for each house. And there were committees of internees dealing with specific areas of camp life. Commercial activities also developed within all the camps as internees began to pay each other for a wide range of services. These ranged from paying to read smuggled newspapers in the early days, on a sliding scale from a shilling to read it in the morning down to a penny for the remaining fragments in the evening, to paying a cobbler to mend one's shoes or a dentist for a filling. Gradually, of course, the musicians in the camps also wanted to be paid for the concerts that they were giving. And in one of Hans Keller's letters from Huyton camp in September, for example, he mentions playing in the orchestra for the camp variety shows. And says that everyone else, from the person who designs the scenery to the orchestra porter, gets paid. Which is why Jekyll, Huttenbach and I are going today to the Camp Entertainment Committee to make clear that either we get paid or we won't play anymore. So I'll hand over now back to Norbert, who has got some illustrations, a picture of Mooragh camp, and also is going to introduce the main dramatis personae in our story. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. And yes, I mean, the great discovery, of course, that we can present today is of course Ferdinand Router's diary that has only recently become accessible through Andrea's translation, and she'll tell us more about it in a moment. But in order for you to really enter the world of this incredible diary, I would like to give you a little bit of a like at the beginning of a play where you have the stage set and then the main characters. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and that's going to happen now. And so here you can see that photo that you may have seen before of the actual camp in Mooragh, just outside Ramsey in the north of the island. And you can see really it was a terrace of boarding houses by the seafront, and it was cordoned off with barbed wire. Here two fences. And the camp also continued around the corner in some of the side streets there. And now the personnel of this story. This is Ferdinand Router. It's a photo taken by his son, Peter. Ferdinand Router was an Austrian-born pianist who grew up near Dresden and moved to Britain in the early 30s already. And he traveled the world with the Icelandic singer Engelund, performing folk songs from many lands in many languages. He was very well connected in Britain, and after internment, he co-founded the Anglo-Austrian Music Society. He became a pioneer in music therapy and was also a specialist in chemistry and mushrooms, an expert cook as well. When he was interned, he was 38 years old. Here is a photo of Ferdinand Router and Engelund at the piano, another of Engelund. We recorded this folk song album, Engelund's Books of Folk Songs, in the mid-2000s with young singers all singing in their native languages at the Royal College of Music. So this is a CD that you can find if you want to hear the music of these arrangements of Ferdinand Router. Peter Gelhorn. Peter Gelhorn was a pianist and composer and conductor, originally from Breslau. He studied in Berlin and emigrated to Britain in 1935. He had a busy career in Britain as a pianist, conductor and chorus master. He conducted hundreds of performances at the Royal Opera House, also at Glyndebourne, where he became chorus master. And then he worked at the BBC as the director of the BBC Chorus, or the BBC Singers as they are known now. Gelhorn and his compositions, including some written in Mooragh camp, were the subject of a research project at the Royal College of Music in 2016. And you can find information about all this project and all the sheet music that we edited on this website, petergelhorn.com. Now, Hans Keller, whose biography Alison has written, and we will hear some of his letters from internment later on. So he was here's a picture, by the way, of him taken by, drawn by a fellow internee, and a photo of taken after the war. A musician and writer, he was a violinist, excellent violinist, and writer and broadcaster who worked for the BBC, wrote several influential books about music, especially, for example, Music and Psychology, which is a really important theme for him. And he championed the music of Schoenberg and Benjamin Britten, for example. He was married to the artist Milan Kosman, who was famous for her drawings of musicians and dancers. Alison will introduce Keller more in detail later. He was just 21 years old when he arrived on the Isle of Man. The artist Hugo Dachinger, who painted the image on the front cover of Alison's book about Keller and internment, he was also mentioned in Rauter's diary. Then there is Oskar Adler, a fascinating man, a violinist, a leader of a string quartet in Vienna for many years, but also an astrologer, and he has a huge legacy as an astrologer as well. He was a close friend of Arnold Schoenberg since their school days in Vienna, and he was the teacher of the young Hans Keller in Vienna. And he was already 65 years old when he was interned in 1940. Then this is Norbert Brennan, the first violinist of the famous Amadeus Quartet, here playing together with Ferdinand Router in Rauter's flat, Carlton Hill in North London. And the Amadeus Quartet was founded in 1948, and they played together for nearly 40 years. And the cellist of the quartet, Martin Lovett, who very sadly died in April this year, just a few months ago, he often referred to Norbert Brennan as a musical genius, who he loved to play for. He came to London from Vienna in 1938 and studied violin with the famous virtuoso and teacher Max Rostal, who had come to London from Berlin in 1934. Brennan was just 17 years old when he was interned. And this is Hans Schidloff, who later changed his name to Peter Schidloff, who played the viola in the Amadeus Quartet, and also on many occasions as a soloist. Schidloff came to London from Vienna on the Kindertransport. He was 18 years old when he was interned, and later, like Norbert Brennan, became a student of Max Rostal. Ferdinand Router introduced Brennan and Schidloff in internment in Priest Heath, and Brennan and Schidloff were sent to a different camp on the Isle of Man, Onken, where they met Sigmund Nissel, and that was the story where they first met, and then later played together and later founded the Amadeus Quartet. The next person here is Paul Hamburger, who was a wonderful pianist and vocal coach. This is also a photo by Peter Rauter, Ferdinand Router's son. And Paul Hamburger studied in Vienna and escaped to Britain in 1939. And then in Britain worked as a pianist and accompanied many famous singers and instrumentalists, including, for example, Dame Janet Baker. Paul Hamburger worked at Glyndebourne, then at the BBC for many, many years, broadcasting leader performances and instrumental chamber music as well for many years. And he taught at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, where in 1998 he was my German leader coach when I came to Britain. He was 19 when he was interned, also very young. And after internment, he received a scholarship to study at the Royal College of Music. Then this is Hans Fryen, who was born in Berlin. He became a music teacher, pianist, and music critic. He taught in different schools in Britain, in Huntingdon, Huddersfield, and Bedford, and was a very active music critic for the Bedfordshire Times. He was also a very active member of the Association of Jewish Refugees, and he wrote for the journal AGR information. Fryen was 30 years old when he was interned, and his second son, Michael, who actually I just saw yesterday and who may be with us today. Michael was born in London in August 1940 while his father was in internment, and he only saw him months later when Hans saw his son only months later after his release. Yeah, and then this is Kurt Kassierer, the final person on our list of the main personnel. Of course, then not everybody is included here, but Kurt Kassierer came from a very distinguished and influential German Jewish family, and he was the son of Max Kassierer, a businessman and local politician in Berlin. Kurt Kassierer studied art history in Freiburg, Munich and Berlin, and wrote his PhD under the supervision of the renowned art historian Heinrich Wölfflin. It is known that he was an art dealer in Rome in the 1920s. He was 57 at the time of the internment. So there's a big generational variety among the internees. Now I will hand on with no further ado to Andrea, who will, and stop the screen share now, who will read from her father's diary.
Thank you, Norbert. My father, Ferdinand Router, known as Rau, kept a diary in something called Gabelsberger Kurzschrift from the age of 12 until his death. This shorthand was taught to gymnasium pupils in Austria and is especially difficult to decipher, as everyone developed their own idiosyncratic version. Some of the diaries, including those from his time in internment, have now been transcribed into German, and I'm in the process of translating them into English. To put his time at Mooragh into context of the total time he spent in internment of 23 weeks, I'll briefly mention the camps he was in before, as he met people there who remained friends and musical colleagues throughout his life. Rau is arrested on Monday, the 1st of July 1940, and taken to Ladbroke Grove police station, where he meets Peter Schidloff. He approaches Rau as he's playing chess against himself. Rau loved chess and played a lot during internment. The two stay together through their time in the camps of Worth Mills and Priest Heath and remain friends for life. In Priest Heath, Rau also meets Norbert Brennan, Egon Welles and George Isserlis. I quote, 29 July. A young violinist from C camp called Norbert Brennan comes over and plays me the last movement of Mozart's A major concerto. I am deeply moved to hear the music again after such a long time, and he plays incredibly well, and I bring him together with Schidloff, who more than swoons over him. The two become friends immediately, and Brennan begins to teach him. Brennan was a pupil of Rostow's. July 31. Brennan plays his own arrangement of the Bach A minor concerto with the violinist Isserlis. Excellent. The evening is suddenly interrupted because the new camp commandant, an unpleasant lieutenant colonel, raises hell and severely reprimands Captain Harris for giving permission for something of this nature in the evening. We're sad and furious. 25 August. In the evening, a concert with Brennan and Schidloff and a poet who reads from his own works. The boys play pieces they've arranged superbly, and a composition by Brennan, which is incredibly witty and a mixture of various romantic composers. Rau travels to the Isle of Man Mooragh camp on the 26th of August 1940. Brennan and Schidloff are on the same ship. From the diaries, we get a feeling of daily life, the mundane as well as the extraordinary. And Rau realizes on arrival that life in this camp will be much better than in the previous ones. But he also sees some things that worry him. And shortly after his arrival, he writes, I'm out of sorts. I feel a kind of homesickness for Priest Heath. Life here seems so wrong. It seems that an unpleasant capitalist state is developing. Comradeship seems overall to have ceased. Those with money sit in the coffee house and let others do their work. Despite having a coffee house and canteen, the quality and availability of food was often a problem, and the internees often relied on food parcels from outside. I quote, the food in our house is especially bad, as it is yet once again fried salted herrings, which are absolutely inedible. I go to eat in house 28. Mooragh camp was peopled by artists, doctors, scientists, writers, mathematicians, artists, and musicians. And many who practiced other professions also played musical instruments and became part of the camp's creative, vibrant, and musical artistic life. They also shared their knowledge with each other by way of lectures, workshops, and courses. Here are a selection of such events recorded in Rau's diaries. August 6. Pastor Crum gives an excellent talk on the apocalypse and the totalitarian state. 29. An analysis of the Waldstein Sonate by Hamburger. September 5. A young and talented Jewish museum, Fryen, who seems to know an enormous amount about Jewish folk songs, gives a lecture on Jewish folk music. 16 September. I give a talk in a medical society on my experience with the blind, and it goes quite well. Rau's father was a director for the School of the Blind, first in Austria and then in Aussig. 15th October, Van Leuven gives a lecture on the serious and light-hearted stories of theatre life. Another quote, afterwards I hear the end of the literary evening. Deutsch reads from his Hitler's 12 Apostles and Bieber from the alphabet, subtle and full of wit. Again, Fryen gives an excellent and lively lecture on Mendelssohn. There were priests and rabbis, Nazis and communists, Jews and Christians, understanding and humane guards, as well as cruel and destructive ones. Kind and aware elected house fathers, leaders, as well as self-important ones, who gladly wielded their newly found authority. Internees were also upset by the pilfering by guards and by sometimes of other inmates. I quote, our house father Lisa, seems to be either a great enemy of art or ignorant, as he will not allow piano practice during the lunch hour. I'm getting utterly sick of this man's Viennese opposite tone. Rau, who is a good and creative cook as well as an expert on mushrooms, for which he forages, I'll expand later, puts himself forward as a cook for house number 28 on the day of his arrival, but not for long because on Tuesday the 27th of August he writes, I check out the camp and discover that there's an education bureau, which is led by a man called Dr. Wojcinski. He is responsible for music and entertainment. In house number 10, there is a proper stage which has fallen rather into disintegrated due to lack of fluid use. The house piano is mainly used by Peter Gelhorn, Paul Hamburger, who is supported by Kurt Kassierer, who's a dilettante but a very good violinist, and the cellist is Dr. Brüss. Pastor Hansen has been the manager up till now, but they're looking for someone who can take over. My full beard makes me look much older than I am, and my interest in cooking melts away as I try to push myself forward. I then realized to my horror that Fryen seems to have been sent to a different camp, as he isn't with us. Neither is Kraus or Schidloff. Rau takes over the music library as well as the camp's music organization and eventually gets his special pass. I quote, I get my pass for the main gate which states to look after camp music. Now this involves performing, starting a choir, tuning pianos, arranging to get them mended and moved, trying to get music in from the outside, composing, arranging, copying out parts and more. And throughout this time, Rau still writes accompaniments for his musical partner, the singer Engel Lund. On top of this, each camp member has also considerable household duties, the amount that he managed to pack into one day beggars belief. I'll quote from some of the organizational things. 2 o'clock, meeting with the other members of the education office, where internal decisions are made. Mooragh and Chrysler will oversee the cabaret, Härtner the literary side and either music, Landsberg education, and Visa will manage the technical side. 3 p.m. choir practice. We begin to learn the Lindenbaum. Then a meeting with Kassierer and Landsberg to discuss a wish list of music which we may be able to get in through the Home Office. Next day, I have the good piano taken out of our house and taken to number 10. We will then be able to rehearse in peace without being disturbed. October 23. I have been given permission to have the light on until 11 p.m. to write out music. October 25. At 10 a.m., I go with the piano technician to the pool to look at the grand piano. I've been given permission to allow to send his tools. I go to Spencer to write a letter to this effect, then back to Arthur to fetch the tuning key and to ask for a pass. He makes a joke to say that there can hardly be any permit that I did not have or wanted to have. I then pop into the youth group's rehearsal for Eddie Lechner by Jura Sofa. That evening, a farewell supper for Marischka, who's going to the Pioneers. He performs a few enchanting things in various dialects. Van der Ziel speaks movingly. These days, we have to be back in our rooms by 9:45. Now, Ra sets up a choir for 6 men initially. This later grows and becomes an accomplished choir and performs on many occasions. He writes original songs for them as well as arrangements. He works closely with Gelhorn, Hamburger, Fryen, and later with Keller. They perform in various combinations at many chamber concerts and recital evenings, as well as in cabaret and jazz evenings with the brilliant jazz singer and violinist Sidney Engel and Buckley Cohen-Somers. He writes about Engel. Engel is called Bunker Engel, as he probably takes too many liberties with the officers and spends a lot of time in the bunker. The amount of music making is astonishing, and Rao reported every program in detail in his diary, which of course I don't have time to give here. But here are some of the musical activities. I quote, "In the morning, the young pianist Paul Hamburger brings me the Brahms Haydn variations, which we immediately play. He's thrilled. I have to reconsider my judgment of him, as he really plays very musically. Up till now, I had found him rather dry and an academic. At 11:30, I go swimming in the sea for the first time. It's very cold." 6 September. In the morning, I attend a culture committee meeting, and we discuss camp youth education, which is problematic, as the young people do not want to engage voluntarily, and there's a danger that they will become degenerate from doing nothing. 7 September. After lunch, I play all 3 Schubert sonatas with Dr. Schweitzer. He doesn't play well, but it still brings pleasure. That evening, the first chamber music concert. 14 September. At 4 p.m., the first rehearsal with the orchestra that I have promised to bring together. There are many violins, 2 tuned down violins as viola, 1 cello with 2 players, and a double bass, which no one can play. Dr. Billig says he'll try and learn it. Now, Gelhorn has set a poem by Bieber, who's in the camp, for 4 voices and orchestra, which I find very beautiful, and it speaks of freedom. We try it, but the orchestra part is too difficult, and it seems rather hopeless. But we try despite this, and at my request, Gelhorn directs it. You'll have a chance to see a recorded performance by Norbert and his group later on. Next day, I go to the library and get a double bass and take it to Dr. Billig. Wednesday, the 2nd of October, 1940. I get to know the poet Bieber more closely, and he shows me poems with names of English animals, which I find enchanting. In our house, as in all others, Jewish New Year is being celebrated today. The table is festively set, and I and the other only non-Jew in the house are both invited. I hold a little speech in which I ask the Jews, please not to forget the Aryans who left Germany in a feeling of empathy with the Jews, and that they ask for their friendship. 9th of October, 1940. I get up at 6 a.m. During a terrible storm, I accompany the friends who are leaving the North Gate. I practice the piano in the afternoon. We then have a cabaret meeting to discuss the violinist Engel, who behaves like a star and puts on airs. He shows no feelings of comradeship. I practice and have a bath, and in the evening, I give my first piano recital. in which I am very nervous and ruin the beginning. Afterwards, a few people have tears in their eyes, and Hamburger and Gelhorn thank me especially. New arrivals from Huyton at 9:30. Now, one of these is Hans Keller, which we'll hear later. The storm continues. Thursday, October the 10th. After the stormy night, a beautiful morning dawns. I go for a walk, and several familiar faces from Priest Heath turn up. Our jazz pianist, Cohen Buddy Summers, is released to join the Pioneers. Now, joining the Pioneer Corps was one of the ways in which internees try to get out of internment, as Hans Keller testifies in one of his letters to his mother. 11th October. In the morning, I go with Van der Ziel and a few others to the swimming pool. I think this must have been some stage that's set up there to prepare the stage for the Jewish service. The harmonium is also dragged there. I go backwards and forwards with the guard and without a guard and feel completely free. At 6 p.m. to the Fool for the major Jewish service. The harmonium is on stage where I am together with the rabbis. It's a very strange feeling as the only goy to sit up there and play. But there are moments of fun and joy too. Sunday the 13th of October. I go to Mass, practice, and after lunch we're allowed to go on the staff outing with little Himmler, as we call Captain Fels. Only a couple of officers accompany us. We walk through the village, then into a valley up the mountain until we arrive on an open heath. I find a few goat slips and boletos, these are mushrooms. There is a most beautiful view from the top, the first taste of freedom for months. When I get back to camp, I pick a few more goat slips, I prepare the mushrooms in the kitchen and serve them to the officers in house number 13. Everyone tries them apart from Bellingham, and they say it tastes very good. So I give them a lecture on mushrooms. In the evening, I repeat my piano recital. October 20th. I go to Mass, do my washing, piano practice, and then play with the new violinist Hans Keller for the first time. He's the second violinist of the Adler quartet and seems as opinionated as Adler seems to be. November 12th. In the morning, a rehearsal for the youth theatre, opening of the art exhibition by Dachinger, the opening of our music seminar course. Fryen gives a particularly good talk on the well-tempered clavier. November 28th, I tune the piano, a repeat of the chamber music evening, but this time I play the Mozart G major with Keller, and he plays much better. 14th of November, Gerhard Wolkenstein, who plays Fritzi in Lechner, is going to be released tomorrow, so we immediately have to recast. We have a quick dress rehearsal at 10, and in the evening, a performance of Eddie Lechner Pferd ins Paradies. Nürnberger speaks of the author Jura Seufer, whose friend he was, and with whom he was in the concentration camp. Jura Seufer died there. He himself plays Eddie very well. Herten recites the poems, and I play the slow movement of Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata. I have composed the final chorus, which is written in the style of the threepenny opera, and it goes down well. It became quite a problem for the remaining internees when colleagues and friends were suddenly released, and there was no one to take their place. Rau writes, I'm very tired, and after a dream in which I dreamed that I'd been released, I'm very depressed. On Saturday, the 5th of October, 1940, we are told that all applications for release should be handed in again. It is explained that this is due to the change of ministers. On October the 4th, Herbert Morrison became Home Secretary, and Chamberlain as well as Anderson resigned. Tuesday, October the 15th. A lovely letter from a man called C. Reichert arrived to me. He knows Vaughan Williams and says that Vaughan Williams has promised to help secure my release. Now, the famous composer and highly respected and loved Ralph Vaughan Williams chaired the committee which recommended to the Home Office the release of musicians from British internment camps. On his release, Rau was invited to join this committee. October 21st. In the evening news, it reports that the white paper has been extended and now artists of standing can be released. Tuesday, the 3rd of December, 1940. At 9:30, I give my first chemistry lesson for about 30 pupils, which gives me great joy. And just as the lesson ends, a young man from the office runs in and shouts, "Rauter, you're released." I'm shattered. I suddenly feel that the whole work I've built up here and the love I have for my comrades is suddenly to end. Next morning, out of total exhaustion, I stay in bed until 12 noon. The doctor marks puts a filling in my lower right wisdom tooth. After lunch, Gelhorn, Hamburger and Landsberg come to me to discuss my successor. Gelhorn will lead the choir. Quartet rehearsal at 4:15 with Gelhorn, so I can introduce him to Adjutant Adler to ask him to give Gelhorn the same privileges that I have. He's immediately given a camp permit and a pass. Friday 6th, the Snowfell Hotel at 8 p.m. for my farewell. The big hall is full. I play the D major Mozart Sonate 4 hands with Hamburger. Stjasny sings The Musikanten bei Wolf, Liebe Sternchen bei Haydn, and An die Musik. I play the Mozart F minor variations with Gelhorn 4 hands and the Schubert M major rondo. To finish, we play the first movement of the C minor piano quartet by Brahms with Keller, Lasseli and Schweitzer. Landsberg gives me a boring but heartfelt address and presents me with a list of addresses which will be useful to me on my release. Monday the 9th of December, last day of internment. Bellingham bids us farewell. We go into a bus. We leave the camp in the darkest night. After roughly 1.5 hours, we arrive in Douglas, where we go to the police station to get our exit permits. Next, a ticket, and at 7:30, after exactly 23 weeks in internment, I'm free once more. I will now pass on to Alison. What?
No, I think it's Norbert now.
It's Norbert. Sorry, Norbert. As always. Thank you.
Oh, thank
Sorry.
you, Andrea. I mean, you can imagine, ladies and gentlemen, just hearing these very detailed notes by Ferdinand Router, so personal and so characterful. For Alison, who has edited Hans Keller's letters from internment, and for me, who has learned a lot about Peter Gelhorn's time there and his music, it was just fascinating to piece together this image that emerges, and so we're really happy that we can share that with you today. So I want to move on now to Peter Gelhorn, but just to say it was really because of meeting Andrea and her mother Claire in the mid-2000s in the Austrian Cultural Forum that I and also many of my colleagues and students at the Royal College of Music have become involved in this story of the emigres, and the Singing a Song in a Foreign Land project really came from that, when we've been exploring a lot of the music by the emigres. And then in 2016 we had the opportunity to do this extended research project about Peter Gelhorn, because we knew that there was all this sheet music that Peter Gelhorn had, in his cupboard, in his drawer. That we knew that it existed from a film that was recorded around the turn of the centuries. But so we went to the British Library and we had a look, and there was a number of pieces written in internment. And Mooragh, the piece that you're going to hear in a moment, really stood out because it's scored for strings, a string quartet, and actually a double bass as well, which is part of it, and also a male choir. And of course we've already heard about this choir which Ferdinand Router started and then Peter Gelhorn conducted, and I think he was having his trouble getting this choir to be up to standard, but he was doing his very best. So we then were able to edit this piece, and it's possible for you to download the score for free from the website petergelhorn.com and through RCM Editions. Now, to start with, I'm going to share my screen again, and I want to show you a short excerpt from a film that was recorded in 1991 that actually shows Peter Gelhorn I need to close this, returning to the Isle of Man, and you know, you can actually see him revisiting the site of the camp and telling you know, about his experience and about you know, also his philosophical reflections about it, which are very fascinating. So I would encourage you to turn up the volume a little bit on your computers, because the sound quality is not as not just perfect, but I hope you can hear it. And I'm going to have to find the right part of this video. I'm going to start playing it now. And so we're starting here.
This little island, clinging to the very edge of Europe, was suddenly host to the cream of the continent's artists and musicians. Peter Gelhorn was already one of Europe's most promising pianists. When he was interned, he was allowed no musical scores, and the only book he brought, a study of Scarlatti, was taken from him. But the waters of Ramsey Bay, which separated his internment peninsula from the main island, couldn't separate him from his music.
I've never done more music in my life than I did here. Of course, I hadn't got my music, but I eventually reconstructed my piano repertoire, bit by bit, bar by bar, so to speak. And eventually I got most of my pieces in trim again. I gave various piano recitals without ever having to repeat the piece, and without having the music here. And opposite the house, where I had a harmony class, I remember having a little blackboard on which which I wrote notes and so on, staves. Then in the Snaefell Hotel, as it was then called, we did concerts and rehearsals, and we had a cabaret too. The English officers came to our performances quite often. There was a very good violinist, a man called Sidney Engel, who didn't speak a word of German because his family had emigrated to England in the 1880s. Well, this certainly looks changed. And the camp also taught us that the world inside and outside the camp were not so different from one another, really. Otherwise, it was really a microcosm of the world. Well, this is now nearly 50 years. Yes, this is 50 years since I was released. It's about this time in January I got out. It's exactly 50 years ago. There was practically a university in this camp. The young people could, the doctors had one house where they had seminars every day. People were learning things all the time. I think there were 1 or 2 Nobel Prize winners among the internees, professors and scientists. They did lectures. Like in the university, they lectured on all subjects you can imagine. I remember when we were released, we looked back at the gate and there were the faces of the people who were left behind. They were quite a few months longer than we were. And one of my friends who was released with me said, yes, the faces look strange and it's sad to look at them, but it's not as bad as looking at the faces in Buchenwald when you got out of that, knowing that you probably not see any of them alive again. Whether you're free or not, it's really something that happens inside you. Nobody can make you a prisoner if you don't want to be one.
But there is one.
So this film is available on YouTube. I would really recommend it. It's called His Majesty's Most Loyal Enemy Aliens. Do search for it without the word most, otherwise you won't find it. So His Majesty's Loyal Enemy Aliens. It also shows the Amadeus Quartet, being well on the Isle of Man and all that. So I would like to continue now, just briefly showing you a few images from our visit in 2017 to Mooragh. By the way, I must mention, I just had a message from a lady who lives in Ramsey, who lives just by the pier, so very close by, who is watching this very event, and she was saying it's a beautiful sunny evening there today. So here is a photo of the promenade, and you can still see the places where the poles of the barbed wire fence, the 2 rows, were in the ground. So there's still evidence of this there today. And we went in 2017 with Ensemble Émigré to perform a number of concerts on the island, including the piece Mooragh by Peter Gelhorn. And we were hosted by Culturvannen, who is a wonderful heritage organization on the Isle of Man. And also, Manx National Heritage are now actually a partner in our research project at the Royal College of Music. So we're looking forward to going back there as well. So this is what it looks like probably still today. And there was a cat we met at the promenade, and there's actually one of the pieces that Gelhorn wrote, and for a string quartet in Mooragh is called Cats, and it's a sort of probably a parody, and you can imagine that cats were able to roam very freely through the barbed wire fence, unlike the internees inside. There's this Barbara Gelhorn, the daughter of Peter Gelhorn, who was with us then, and I think is with us tonight as well, and some of her siblings as well. And this was a performance in Douglas of the piece Mooragh, and some other compositions from the Isle of Man, including Hans Gahl's What a Life. And we were joined here by some students from Ramsey Grammar School who sang along and also played along the viola there as well. And so we were able to just introduce the music also to a younger generation on the Isle of Man. Now, I want to play the performance of Mooragh, the piece by Peter Gelhorn, which we recorded in Ramsey Town Hall in 2017, and the film team was provided by Culturvannen, and will also become available on YouTube soon through their YouTube channel. And so before I play it, I will read the poem, but also just to listen. I mean, you remember from Rauter's diary that he said it's rather difficult actually to perform. It's the orchestral part, and it's played in our performance by a string quartet, is really challenging, and also for the singers it's not an easy piece, but it's a sort of testament of the aspiration in the music making, and actual the quality of the players as well, and singers. And also it has a wonderful positive feel about it as well. So here's the poem by Beaver, which was originally published in the Mooragh Times in August 1940. Beyond barbed wire, the sea, and the sun's last fire burning up a tree, and a cottage on the green hill. Gulls idle on the beach, then rise into the air and cry. The field across the bay we cannot reach. We can but pace our cage and let our hungry eye take in far loveliness, which will remain beyond our sadness and beyond despair, beyond our stubborn hope, beyond our fair and puzzled sense of justice. They will stand, this bay, this pier, this beach, this sea, this distant friendliness of wooded land, to bid farewell to us when we are free.
And the stars Beyond the sun.
Right. So I'll hand over to Alison now. Thank you.
Okay, that was lovely, Norbert. I'm still getting over it. Right, just a little introduction. Hans Keller was in his last year at school at the time of the Anschluss in 1938. So he's one of the younger internees. And his family spent many months trying to get out of Austria. This was not an easy process, and unfortunately he was still in Vienna at the time of the November pogrom that year. When he was arrested by the Gestapo, he was imprisoned, he was beaten, and actually lined up for execution. He really thought he'd never get out of there. He managed to escape because he had an English brother-in-law, Roy Franey, who got a British visa for him. If you're interested in knowing more about his Viennese experiences in 1938, you might like to know that Keller gave an account of his escape in a Radio 4 program in 1974, which you can also hear via YouTube now. So if you search for Hans Keller, The Time of My Life, which was the name of the program, you should find it on YouTube. Moving on to Keller's internment here in Britain. Perhaps I could start by showing you what a letter from an internment camp looks like. So if Norbert would kindly share his screen again, we have an image. Oh, hang on just a moment.
Alison, yeah, okay.
Is it working?
I think it should be working now. I had a frozen screen for a moment, so I'll try.
The wonders of technology.
Oh, we've been doing very well so far.
It's gone very well so far. Yeah, the music was the most important bit.
So here it comes.
There we are. Right. So you can see here two of Keller's early letters, and these are from Huyton camp. And as you can see, oh, there we go. Right, so they're bigger now. So as you can see, we've got two very different looking documents there. The one on the right is an official letter, And the one on the left is a very unofficial letter that Keller managed to smuggle out of the camp about 3 weeks after his arrival. Now, he only managed to do this once. All the other letters from internment that we have are the official type. But I wanted to show you this contrast so that you can appreciate how constrained the correspondence from the camps was. Internees had to write on this specially designed letter paper that you can see on the right, which was folded and sent without an envelope. There were marks to show you where to fold it and a little slit into which you tucked the flap so that it remained unsealed until it had been through the censor's office. You had to print clearly so that the censor could read it, and you can see the difference here between Keller's printing and his normal handwriting in the letter on the left. And you were allowed to write only 24 lines. Each internee was permitted to write just 2 letters a week like this. But in the early weeks of mass internment, the supplies of the official paper were very scarce, so in practice it was much less than this. Even so, the military postal system was completely overwhelmed by the huge numbers in the camps. An official inquiry at the beginning of August found a backlog of 100,000 letters from internees in the Liverpool censor's office. So the information that an historian gets from letters like this is quite different from a diary such as Ferdinand Router wrote. Unsurprisingly, many of Keller's letters, especially the early ones like this, are dominated by practical matters, things he wants his mother to try and send in and ways he might be able to get out. Later, when he's writing from Mooragh and Life is Better, you begin to get more of a picture of camp life. So I'll read you a few excerpts from the Mooragh letters now. And I think we can stop screen sharing at this point. Thanks, Norbert. Okay, so I'll start with Keller's account of his arrival at Mooragh. Now you remember from Andrea's reading of Ferdinand Router's diary, him mentioning a terrible storm on the 9th of October, during which a ship comes in with the new arrivals from Huyton. And Hans Keller was on that ship together with his uncle, Hans Grotter. And this is what Keller wrote to his mother the next day. Dear, dear Mutscheli, here we are, happily in yet another camp. The journey was somewhat uncomfortable as the sea was very rough. A ship licensed for 220 people was filled with 1,000. And in addition, not all facilities were accessible. The rest I leave to your oh so seaman-like imagination. I'd only add that today we're feeling okay again. The arrival was last night, sea journey 5 hours instead of the normal 3. Uncle Hans is okay. I've still got muscle pains from vomiting and trying not to vomit, as well as bruises. When the ship seemed to be standing on its head, I would slide over my fellow passengers' vomit from one end to the other, where I stayed lying down until I slid back again. But that lying on the floor and sliding was still better than trying to sit up, as practiced by Uncle Hans. I admit he was warmer and not vomited over as much by others and did less sliding around in other people's vomit, but I'm sure that he himself would have felt better if he'd done as I did. I did wear the life jacket as I was told to, but I also used it as a pillow so that my head stayed clean. Only once did a pianist friend of mine throw up right in my face. Here it's quite nice, hotels by the sea and no air raids. Please send me warm leggings. Those you sent a while ago are too small. I can only do up the lowest button. There are wonderful periodicals with philosophical articles to read here. Kisses, Hans. So that's all he could get into the 24 lines. Now, as you can be imagined, Keller plunged eagerly into the musical life of the camp, and he became particularly close friends with Peter Gelhorn and Paul Hamburger. All 3 of them ended up at the BBC together in later years. Keller and Hamburger were the same age, and they were both from Vienna, and they formed not only a musical but also an intellectual bond. They were both very widely read and deeply interested in philosophy as well as music. And after they got out of the camps, they developed their thinking and writing together. For some years, Paul Hamburger remained one of Keller's most important thinking partners. He later wrote, "Hamburger always inspires me." Of Peter Gelhorn, Keller wrote to his mother, "Gelhorn and I are very great friends. He is a consummate musician and a profound human being. Gelhorn's musical maturity and at the same time his technical perfection, plus his human qualities, bear only one comparison, Oscar as he must have been when he was young." Now, that Oscar Keller refers to here was Oscar Adler, whom Norbert has already mentioned as a very influential quartet leader in Vienna. In the interwar years, the Adler Quartet gave intimate chamber music performances every week to a small circle of Vienna's leading musicians, and Keller was lucky enough to be there. The composer Franz Schmidt was the quartet's cellist at that time, and he used to call these sessions the real university for chamber music. Keller's family knew Adler and Schmidt well, so Keller grew up with their playing. It was Keller's English brother-in-law who got Adler and his wife a British visa as well in 1938, after Schoenberg had tried and failed to get him to America. Adler was interned with Keller in Huyton camp, and when they managed to get their instruments, they played quartets every day, which, as Keller wrote to his mother, made life in internment subjectively completely marvellous. Unfortunately for Keller, but fortunately for Adler, this musical heaven lasted only a few weeks, as Oscar Adler was one of the first internees released in August. When Keller arrived in Mooragh, his only disappointment was, as he wrote to his mother, "There is no quartet. I was supposed to have given a sonata recital here with Ferdinand Router, whom I know from Vienna and London as a marvellous pianist, and who knows of me by hearsay, but I refused because of the poor violin. So I'll give a chamber music evening with him, Brahms Piano Quartet in C and Beethoven Trio. I shall earn something from that. However, my hands aren't in the best condition because of lugging sacks of coke and other things. For a viola, we're using a violin with viola strings. We do each have our own room here, but it's so small that one person hardly fits in. Please send me a bow if it's not too troublesome. The Isle of Man must be really lovely if one's not interned. One should come and live here, apart from the sea journey." And a couple of weeks later, he writes, "I've received the bow, wonderful. Also the parcel with fruit and sugar. If the fruit is so expensive, don't send me any, because we do occasionally get apple puree here, so fresh fruit is not absolutely necessary, though of course I do enjoy eating it very much. I'm now leading a string quartet. Second violin poor, viola middling, cello middling. We're practicing the Rider Quartet and Mozart's first D major quartet, the only sheet music we have. I am stricter than Oscar, and I plague the gentlemen for hours over a few bars. They are sweet and patient. Only once was slight opposition detectable when I took the upbeat to the trio of the Rider Quartet with a glissando. Adler will know what I mean. Now they're all playing the upbeat with glissando." In a few of Keller's later letters, he sends some instructions for his cousin Inge, who was now playing quartets with Oscar Adler and Keller's mother. And I'll read you one of those letters to give you a sense of the kind of quartet leader that the young Keller would have been for the gentleman in Mooragh. Referring to the solo in number 46, if I remember rightly, she has to be careful to maintain the rests between the semiquavers without breaking the line of the melody. In a word, to play the rests. The demi-semiquaver runs as calmly as possible. There she has unlimited time as she is leading, so the more controlled and apparently slowly she plays them, the faster they will sound. No writ at the end, but in such a way that it sounds as if there was one. Restrained increase of intensity in the sequences before the end, with an inner urgency. Upbeats with strong resonance, but nevertheless leading to the first beats of the sequences. Live with the rests between the sequences, that is, with the playing of the others, even when you're practicing. That's the only way to achieve a continuously developing intensification. Right, now she must practice all that, and when I come, it has to be first class. I'd like to follow up now from the passage that Andrea read from her father's diary about the Jewish New Year celebration in his house, and the speech that he gave asking his Jewish hosts not to forget the Aryans who left Germany in sympathy with the Jews. Because Hans Keller wrote about this issue in a letter to a psychologist colleague after his release, and this is what he wrote then. There was a small section of Germans, Gentiles, consisting of political and ideological refugees in the camps. Often Jews would not have anything to do with them on account of the strong associations which persisted in their minds between those who'd almost beaten them to death and those who, though fanatically opposed to the present German regime, were nevertheless members of the dreaded people. I know from my personal experience that I had very great difficulty, often hard to overcome, to meet proper Germans with the same attitude with which I met fellow Jews, although I reproached myself with the fact that these Germans were among the strongest enemies of Nazism. The wounds resulting from the physical and psychic persecution have left far-reaching scars, not really cured on me and others. Now, one thing Keller doesn't mention here is that as well as the political émigrés who'd left Germany because of their opposition to the Nazi regime, there were also ordinary migrants who'd come to England for all sorts of other reasons, some of whom would have been members of the Nazi Party or even active sympathisers. So Jews could find themselves interned alongside possible fascists, and that was one of the most serious complaints that was raised by the anti-internment campaigners in Parliament. Related to this issue, there's an interesting passage in the diary of the composer Hans Gahl, which is published in this excellent book by Toccata Press. Now, he'd been living in Edinburgh, so he came within the first wave of arrests after the 10th of May of German and Austrian nationals living near the coast. So he was in that first group to be arrested who were not in Category A. And when he arrived in Huyton, there were Category A people already in the camp. I'd like to read you this section because Gahl mentions an interesting figure who appears a lot of times in Ferdinand Rauter's diary, and he also appears in Keller's letters. This was an enthusiastic amateur musician who seems to have played an important part in the setting up of musical life of Mooragh camp, and also before that in Huyton. And Gahl writes, "The Aryan concept, otherwise for us the most ridiculous of all pieces of nonsense, has assumed a fatal reality here in the camp. People whom the Third Reich sees as Aryans are possible Nazis. One therefore has to take special care in meeting them. I've already been warned against Pastor Hansen. He is a German expatriate. He was active in the German cultural societies. He was interned immediately after the beginning of the war. One shouldn't trust him. Well, I've only spoken to him about music, and he hasn't shown any interest in anything else, but I shall be careful." Despite that, Gahl quickly warmed to Hansen and to his enthusiasm for getting some music started in Huyton. Hansen went round everyone in the camp, making lists of all the musicians and singers, and he badgered the adjutant to return their confiscated instruments to them. And he persuaded Hans Gahl to direct the camp orchestra that he was determined to assemble. "There is no stopping his enthusiasm," writes Gahl. "At least twice a day, Pastor Hansen comes to me in my room. He always has different musical worries. He sings tunes he's composed, full of enthusiasm, and with a quite pleasant tenor voice, and he beams with admiration when I put it down on paper almost as quickly as he can sing it. I like him more and more, because there is something so genuine, so natural and inspired in the best sense of the word. We chat and philosophize a lot. He's good at giving conversational leads, and he's a theologian of the pleasant, undogmatic kind. I've got to know most of the musicians on his list. There are a couple of very good violinists and 2 quite decent flautists who brought their instruments with them. I am wondering whether I shouldn't write a piece of chamber music for the available resources." Well, up until this point, Gahl had been feeling that, quote, "there is not a spark of music left in my body, my brain is dry and dusty." But now that changed, and he began to write a trio for flute and 2 violins, which became his Huyton Suite, Opus 92. Well, Pastor Hansen was transferred to Mooragh camp on the 7th of June, which I think must have been only a week or so after the camp opened. So it could well have been him who first started up the music making in Mooragh as well. As you remember, Ferdinand Router said in his diary that up to now, Pastor Hansen was the music manager, and now they're looking for someone who can take over. And this was because Hansen was now in bed with a heart condition, and one wonders whether he'd exhausted himself. But he was clearly still influential. Music meetings seem to have continued to take place in his room, and he appears very regularly in Router's diary, although Router doesn't seem to have warmed to him quite as much as Gahl had done. But rather touchingly, when Router was released, Hansen presented him with a folk-style composition that he'd written specially for the occasion. Hansen appears in Keller's letters too, and Keller writes, "I've become very friendly with Pastor Hansen. He says Judaism must not disappear because its mission is to carry the moral law around the world. There can't be many priests who don't say Jews should convert. As you've heard from Andrea, when Ferdinand Router was released in December, Peter Gelhorn took over from him for about 6 weeks until he was then released as well. Vaughan Williams's committee, which Router now joined, was increasingly successful at getting the musicians out of the camps. But for those left behind, the remaining music making in the camp grew a bit less satisfying. Keller and Hamburger were still together, but quartets were no longer possible. Playing quartets is what I'm looking forward to particularly, wrote Keller to his mother in February 1941. I've quite forgotten how to do it. Keller was finally released from Mooragh camp just after his 22nd birthday in March 1941, so almost 3 years to the day after Hitler had crossed into Austria on Keller's 19th birthday and changed his life. Because of the restricted nature of Keller's correspondence from the camps, the full significance of his internment experience to his intellectual development can only really be seen from what he wrote after his release. And one thing that's immediately clear is that during his time in the camps, Keller had developed an all-consuming interest in psychoanalysis, which he spent the next few years developing further, to the extent that he apparently amassed an unequalled knowledge of the literature, according to Willi Hoffer. Keller's combination of music and psychoanalysis was one of the things that made his writing so distinctive. But it's perhaps significant that this was not an interest he brought with him from Vienna. Instead, it came out of his exile experience, started in internment, and then developed afterwards while he worked with English collaborators. Similarly, although Keller was later famous for his work on Schoenberg, as Norbert has already said, he showed no interest in Schoenberg's music or even in Bruckner's and Mahler's while he was in Vienna. That was something that came only in England in response to both the enthusiasm and the opposition to these composers amongst British musicians. For someone of Keller's age, one might think of Mooragh internment camp as a kind of cultural limbo, a sort of intellectual no man's land, if you like, in which he was suspended between the Austrian culture in which he was born and his British future. Having been uprooted so traumatically from Vienna, he had about 1.5 years of trying to make a new life in London before he was uprooted again, interned and put back again with all these people from his homeland, while all the time knowing that they couldn't go back to Vienna. And this strange limbo set Keller on a path of rediscovering and rethinking his cultural heritage that had enormously creative results in the years to come. And I'm sure this must have been the case for many internees. Okay, I think I'll hand back to Norbert now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alison. That brings us to the end of our sort of formally prepared event here. Before I would open this out for questions, just wanted to pass back really briefly to Andrea Rauter. And I mean, really for us, it's so fascinating to get a picture from these different perspectives that we now can see as original sources. But I mean, the question remains, but what do we make of this? I mean, it is such an unusual story in history, this particular period, and it had a huge impact, I think, on the lives of those people. What sort of impact it is? Andrea, would you like to just, can you hear? I can see you move, but Andrea, I can't.
Oh, Andrea's muted.
Andrea, could you unmute yourself? Or I can try to unmute you if I...
I think Alex might need to.
Let me see.
Okay, I've been given permission.
Okay, sorry, Andrea.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, what was that last bit?
Well, I just wanted to pass this briefly back to you, just to see, this had a big impact on the lives of those musicians who were there, and in particular, could you perhaps say what it meant for your father and how you would evaluate the whole episode?
Well, I think that a time in a camp with so many different people begins to concentrate your mind, I imagine, on the human beings around you and on what is going on. And I think it must change you completely. Because I know when Rau came out, what he really wanted to do was to help those people. He understood them more. He had seen aspects of people he'd never seen before. And he writes a memorandum to the Home Office in which he asks for various things, but he asks more for psychological help than for practical or physical help. And I think, you know, when people leave, he loses people again, everyone's lost people again. And maybe in this case, people were reunited, but I think it stayed with everybody. And I think he certainly carried out throughout his life, and his work after that was always with and for human beings. And he did, that's what I remember him as a giver, basically, and a listener. And I'm sure that that came from there, because before he was more of a professional and a gadabout. But that's just, sorry, off the cuff.
But of course, that resulted in the foundation of the Anglo-Austrian Music Society, which then was carried that spirit, and also, you know, of these events where music can build a bridge, you know, as it did in Ramsey, in Mooragh with the British officers, you know, then it opened it up to the whole country. And of course, also, you know, those people stayed together, so very close friends. Sorry, Andrea.
So I'm just saying, it just reminded me, the first Wigmore Hall concert on the 15th of December, given by the Anglo-Austrian Music Society, it says in the Wigmore Hall programme, to demonstrate mutual understanding and appreciation between the two countries, the music of each country will be performed by the musician of the other. And I think that actually puts Rau into a nutshell. I think putting people together and building bridges of understanding, I think, is his legacy in my mind.
Thank you.
I've finished now, you'll be glad to know.
Now, are there any questions from people? Please just put them in the chat briefly. But it is, thank you very much for staying with us for all this time, ladies and gentlemen. But I hope you found it interesting. And I've had one comment from a lady in California who was joining us. She had to leave, but she said how wonderful this presentation is, how crazy that I feel imprisoned in California right now. This is truly inspiring, and music can help. So that was from Monica Scott in California. Are there any other comments or questions? Please put them in the chat. Yeah, well, there's nothing coming through at the moment. So thank you very much, everybody, for this you know, shared Monday evening. And as you know, the internment was a very shared experience for those who were there, and you know, they made a huge contribution to music and to life in this country, really. And you know, while it must have been a difficult experience and full of uncertainty, and you know, there was a lot of trauma during this time, you know, the way it helped with you know, the way it lived on is really something quite inspiring for me today as well. So yeah, so there is just a few appreciative comments coming through. No questions, just to say very interesting presentations. Thank you all, and thank you for putting this together. So yeah, thank you very much. I can hand back to Monica. She wants to say any more. You know, there are many more events coming up in this series, and I'll be singing some music by emigre composers Egon Welles and Robert Kahn, and also some Brahms on Sunday afternoon, if you feel to like joining us over a cup of tea. And well, it's been a pleasure to be involved in this, and thank you, Alison and Andrea, for working together on this. It's been a truly inspiring exchange.
Thank you, Norbert.
Thank you very much, all three of you. That was absolutely fascinating and, of course, at times intensely moving. I'm sure everybody will agree. Perhaps I can just round things off by saying not only is there the concert to come on Sunday and the event I mentioned earlier, I think, about Arnold and Alma Rosé, where Anita Lasker-Wallfisch will also be participating on the 30th. But for those of you who are particularly interested in the whole aspect of internment experience, there are two events that took place during Refugee Week in June, which you can actually listen to recordings of on the Insiders Outsiders website if you look in the Refugee Week online event section. One of them was a very entertaining and informative talk by Simon Parkin, specifically looking at Hutchinson Camp and the creative life within it. And the other was a fascinating group discussion about Worth Mills, which of course Ferdinand Router wrote about, experienced of unknown, one of the unknown, much less well-known transit camps that deserves further scrutiny. So thank you everybody, and if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact any of the three speakers today via perhaps the Insiders Outsiders website. There's a contact facility there. They'll come through to me and I'll forward the emails to the appropriate person. Thank you, and I hope to see you again soon. All the very best. Bye.